At the far edge of Brambleford, where the cobblestone streets grew narrow and the soot from the foundries hung low, stood the house on Haywater Lane. 3 stories of gray brick with windows tall and solemn, it loomed over the bend in the road like a quiet observer. Its ivy-choked facade seemed almost too still, as if the walls themselves were listening. To most who passed, the house belonged to Elias and Margaret Kildare, a couple widely regarded as the beating heart of the town's charity. They opened their doors to the orphaned and unwanted, clothed them, fed them, and, in their own words, returned their dignity. The townsfolk admired them in that unspoken way small communities admire those who take on burdens others would rather avoid. In Sunday sermons, their names were spoken with reverence. But if you looked closely, there was a strange rhythm to their charity, a pattern that no one ever seemed willing to voice. Every year or two, the Kildares would host a gathering in their garden, the kind of genteel occasion where the local photographer was invited to take a group portrait. In each photograph, Elias stood tall with a hand resting on the shoulder of a single child, while Margaret's pale gloved fingers lightly gripped the other side. The children were never the same from one year to the next. No returning faces, no familiar eyes. The albums in the photography shop window displayed these images like a proud timeline of benevolence. But there was no record of where the children went after their stay. No new apprenticeships announced, no marriages years later, no graves in the churchyard. The children simply disappeared from the life of the town as quietly as they had arrived. Inside, the Kildare home was immaculately ordered. The scent of beeswax polish clung to every banister. The ticking of numerous clocks filled the air, each set a few minutes apart, creating a faint ripple of disjointed time as you walked the halls. Margaret was said to have a talent for keeping the children still for hours, sewing lessons that demanded absolute silence and meal times that ended only when she folded her hands. Elias was a meticulous man, always making notes in a small leather-bound book that never left his waistcoat pocket. When asked about its contents, he would smile and say it was merely for household accounts, though no one had ever seen him buy so much as a loaf of bread without exact change already in hand. The front parlor was the only room visitors ever saw, and even then, only with the door left half closed. Behind it, the house was a warren of locked doors and winding staircases. Children were never seen playing outside. Their presence was known only by the faint patter of feet in the upper halls and the occasional glimpse of a pale face behind a lace curtain. When the garden parties came, the chosen child would be scrubbed and dressed in immaculate clothes, hair combed to a shine, and a fresh ribbon or tie knotted with perfect symmetry. In the photograph, they often appeared stiff, their smiles thin and brittle, the way a candle flame bends in the wind. No one in Brambleford ever asked about the absence of familiar laughter, or the way the house's lights seemed to burn only in the topmost windows long after midnight. The Kildares' good standing was a kind of shield, and their manners carried a quiet authority that discouraged questions. People told themselves that orphans often left town for work or better homes, and the photographs became just another pleasant piece of the Kildares' history. Yet among the children of the town, there was an unspoken rule: never linger too long near Haywater Lane. Some claim to have heard strange hums from its walls, low and mechanical, or to have seen Elias in the garden at dawn, measuring the soil with a brass instrument and writing in his book before anyone else had risen. Over the years, the house seemed to grow more withdrawn, its bricks darkening, the ivy thickening until it was nearly impossible to see where the mortar ended and the plant began. The Kildares themselves never appeared to age much, their hair turning silver but their posture unchanged. And always, every year or two, a new photograph would appear, Elias, Margaret, and a child who was gone before anyone had learned their voice. The town's memory was a short one, but the photographs were not. They endured, quietly marking the passage of children who entered the Kildare house and never stepped beyond it again. Some would later say that the evil was obvious in hindsight, that there had been a warning in those stiff smiles and hollow eyes. But evil that hides behind kindness does not arrive with fanfare. It seeps in like damp under the floorboards, softening the wood until it collapses beneath your feet. The house on Haywater Lane was not feared in its time. It was admired, envied even, for its grace and charity. That was how it survived for so long. And as the last photograph of that decade was taken with yet another unfamiliar child standing between the couple, no one knew it would be the final one before the truth began to slip through the cracks. The photographs were taken on glass plates, the kind that needed long exposure and an unwavering subject. They were the pride of Edwin Cratchley, the town's only photographer and a man who treated his craft like a quiet religion. He developed each image in the dim red light of his back room, watching the ghosts of faces emerge from nothing. When he handled the Kildare portraits, he noticed something he could not shake. It was not the composition, which was always perfect, nor the lighting, which Margaret seemed to control by arranging everyone just so. It was in the faces of the children, always a single child between the couple, standing so rigid it seemed their bones had been set that way. The smiles were wrong. They were not the easy curves of happiness, but thin shapes, stretched as if carved into the skin. And in every set of eyes there was a bright wetness, not the sparkle of joy, but the residue of tears wiped away too quickly. On a glass plate, detail lived forever. The exposure times caught the tremor in a lip, the faint puffiness of eyes, and the glint at the corner of a cheek where something damp had just been brushed aside. Edwin had seen orphans smile before. Shy, wide-mouthed, uncertain but genuine, yet these smiles looked rehearsed. It was as if the children were trying to pass some invisible inspection. Margaret's hand, always placed on the child's arm, had a grip that showed faint tension in her knuckles. Elias stood with one palm on the child's shoulder, fingers spread slightly as though claiming them. Over the years, as Edwin developed more of these images, the pattern deepened in his mind. He kept copies for his portfolio, lining them up in order. The children's faces never repeated, yet the composition never changed. The same faint sheen in the eyes, the same stiffness, the same strained curve of the lips. To Edwin, it began to feel less like a photograph and more like a record, a ritual being performed with obsessive precision. He told himself it was only his imagination, that perhaps the children were nervous to be photographed, and that the wetness in their eyes was from the sunlight or the cold. But in the privacy of his dark room, the silence pressed in on him. He could hear the slow drip of developing solution into the trays and could smell the acrid tang of the chemicals, and in that lonely half-light the faces on the glass seemed to look at him with a kind of desperate stillness. It was not a plea, it was something colder, a knowing, as if they were aware of what was to come and had already accepted it. The townsfolk who saw the images in his shop window never seemed to notice, or if they did not speak of it. People preferred to see kindness in the Kildares, to believe the photographs captured moments of charity and care. They called the children lucky. They pointed out how clean and well-dressed they looked, how polished their shoes were, and how carefully their hair was combed. No one remarked on the hollowness in the eyes. No one asked why no one ever saw these children again. Edwin began to dread the days when Elias would send word for him to come and photograph a new arrival. Each visit felt the same, the heavy silence inside the Kildare home, the faint scent of something metallic under the beeswax polish, the way Margaret would stand just behind the child and smooth their hair once, twice, 3 times before stepping into place. The children never spoke during the sessions. If Edwin tried to make them laugh, their eyes would flicker briefly toward Elias before returning to the lens. With each new plate, Edwin became more certain that the smile was not for him, not for the camera, but for Elias and Margaret. It was a final performance, a part of something he did not understand. He began to wonder if the camera was not merely capturing the children, but sealing them, preserving some essence before it was taken from them. When he held the plates up to the light, the children's faces seemed to float above the glass, suspended in time, their strained smiles like fragile masks that would shatter if touched. The pattern remained unspoken because to speak it would be to admit suspicion, and suspicion of the Kildares was unthinkable. Edwin told himself he was imagining it, told himself not to look too long at the plates and the lamplight. But still at night he saw those smiles behind his eyelids, and in dreams they widened until they tore. And so the photographs remained, lined neatly in his private drawers, waiting for someone who could see what he saw. But in Brambleford, the kind of person who would look too closely at the Kildares had long since learned to keep their eyes down. The winter room was never spoken of outside the Kildare house. It did not appear on any floor plan, and no visitor was ever shown its door. To reach it, one had to pass through a narrow corridor at the far end of the 2nd floor, where the wallpaper was darker, the air colder, and the light from the lamps seemed dimmer than it should have been. The door itself was plain, painted the same deep brown as the hallway and without a handle on the outside. Only a brass keyhole betrayed its presence, and Elias kept the key on a thin chain beneath his shirt. The children never spoke of the room either, but they knew of it before they saw it. It was the place where they were told to rest before supper, a gentle phrase that disguised the truth. Inside, the chamber was always cold, not the kind of cold that seeped in from winter drafts, but a still unnatural chill that coated the air and clung to the skin. The walls and floor were covered in white tiles, each one rimed with a thin layer of frost, even in the height of summer. There were no windows, no vents, and no visible source for the freezing air. The room was lit only by a single gas sconce high on the wall, its flame casting a dim, shivering glow that made the frost glisten. The smell inside was faint but distinct, like metal left too long in ice water. Margaret would lead the child in, speaking softly, almost kindly, as if she were offering them a comfort. She would place a folded blanket on the single wooden chair in the center of the room, gesture for them to sit, and tell them they would feel better after a little quiet. Then the door would close with a sound that seemed to swallow itself, and the cold would press in on every part of them. The frost beneath the chair would melt slightly from the warmth of their legs, but the air was so bitter it felt as if it were pulling the heat out of their lungs. Elias kept strict timings for these rests. The duration was never told to the children, but it was always long enough for their skin to pale and their lips to grow faintly blue. The cold was not enough to kill, not immediately, but it worked on the body with a slow, deliberate cruelty. Fingers would stiffen, joints would ache, breath would grow shallow, and the mind would begin to slip into a dull, dreamlike state. In that half-conscious haze, the sound of the gas flame seemed louder, almost like a whisper that moved just at the edge of understanding. The Kildares treated the winter room as a step in a process. It was not punishment. It was not even, in their minds, unkind. It was preparation. Elias believed that a child's essence, whatever made them truly theirs, was at its most malleable when the body was weakened, when the spirit hovered between endurance and surrender. The cold slowed everything down, made resistance feeble, and made the will soft enough to shape. Margaret, always precise in her habits, kept a notebook where she marked each child's time in the room and the physical signs they showed when they emerged. When the door opened again, the warmth of the hallway would feel overwhelming, though it was only the normal air of the house. Margaret would wrap the blanket around the child's shoulders and lead them downstairs, her voice soothing, her steps measured. At the supper table, their hands would shake slightly as they held their utensils. They would eat little, though Margaret would encourage them gently. And always, by the next day, they would be quieter, not obedient in the way of a scolded child, but subdued in a deeper, more permanent way. Over the years, the winter room became part of the rhythm of the house, invisible to outsiders but constant to those within. The frost never melted completely, no matter the season. The tiles never cracked or grew damp. Elias never explained its nature, not even to Margaret in words, but in the way he looked at the room after locking the door. It was clear that it served him as more than a physical space. It was a chamber of change, where a child entered as they were and left as something different, something smaller, quieter, and more compliant. There were whispers in the town about the Kildares' discipline, small comments about how quickly their wards learned manners and how they never seemed to misbehave. These remarks were offered with admiration, even envy, but no one thought to ask what methods brought about such results. In Brambleford, results were all that mattered. The process was a private matter, and the Kildares guarded their privacy as carefully as they guarded the winter room key. And so the door remained closed to all but its guests, each one sitting for their allotted time on the wooden chair, each one breathing the frozen air until their thoughts slowed and their bodies yielded. When they left, they carried the cold with them for hours, sometimes days, as if a small piece of the winter room clung to them. Elias liked that. He liked to imagine the frost working its way deeper, settling into the bones, becoming part of them. For in his mind only, when a child had been properly chilled, could they be properly kept. In Brambleford, people learned not to ask where the Kildare children went. They came into the house quietly, often on rainy afternoons, small figures clutching worn bags and wearing expressions that were a mix of fear and fragile hope. For weeks or months, the townsfolk would see them at Sunday service or walking behind Margaret on her errands, their faces pale but polite, their manners praised in low voices by shopkeepers. And then one day they would be gone. No farewells, no mention of relatives waiting in other towns, and no adoption notices in the county records. They simply vanished between one morning and the next, leaving no trace except the faint memory of their eyes in the minds of those who had noticed them at all. There were no graves. The churchyard behind St. Bridget's held markers for war dead and miners lost in accidents, but none for the wards of the Kildares. There were no petitions filed with the orphanage boards or court documents marking legal transfer. If the local constable ever wondered, he kept it to himself, and if the neighbors whispered, they did so only in kitchens after dark. Brambleford was not a place where you press too hard on private matters, especially not those tied to a family as respected as the Kildares. In the locked study at the back of the house, Elias kept his own record of these departures. The ledgers were thick, bound in black leather, their pages yellowing at the edges from the years. Each child's name was written neatly in his hand, followed by the date they entered the home. There were never many other details. No birthplaces, no parents' names, no notes about personality. Just the name, the date, and a small blank space after it. When the time came, Elias would return to that entry with a sharpened pencil, draw a single diagonal slash through the name, and add a small sketch of an hourglass in the margin. The drawing was always the same, narrow, precise, with the sand in the lower half nearly gone. Margaret once asked why he did not simply erase the name or strike it out entirely. Elias told her that the line was not to destroy the name but to mark its completion. The ledgers were stored in a locked drawer, but Elias took them out often. He would sit at the desk in the late hours, the fire low and the house silent, and run his fingers down the columns of names as if reading the history of his own life. Sometimes he would pause at a particular entry and linger over it, tracing the diagonal slash lightly as though recalling the moment the child crossed whatever invisible threshold existed in his mind. The hourglass symbol for him was not an end, but a confirmation. It meant that the process was finished, that the child's purpose in the house had been fulfilled. Margaret never looked in the ledgers herself, but she knew their order well. She knew that every entry followed the same quiet pattern and that every slash was made by Elias alone, never delegated. She also understood in the unspoken way that defined their marriage that the time between a child's arrival and the crossing of their name was not measured in years, so much as in readiness. Some names were slashed within months. Others remained unmarked for years. Elias said little about his method for deciding, but Margaret had noticed the signs, the way his interest in a child's behavior would wane, the way he would speak less about them at supper, and the way the winter room would be used more often in their final weeks. The disappearances never caused a stir beyond the initial moment of absence. In an industrial town like Brambleford, lives began and ended without ceremony every day. Families moved away in search of work, children were sent to relatives in other counties, and accidents took people suddenly. The wards of the Kildares were just another part of that constant shifting. Their stories unremarkable to anyone but the two people who kept them within the house's walls. And so the years passed, and the ledgers grew heavier with names and slashes and hourglasses, a slow accumulation of vanished lives recorded only in Elias's careful hand. No one ever asked where the children went after the hourglass was drawn, and Elias never offered an answer. If pressed, he might have said that they were sent to better circumstances, but such questions rarely came. In truth, the only constant in the entire process was the recording of their names, the marking of their completion, and the quiet satisfaction that seemed to settle over him after each entry was closed. To Elias, the ledgers were not a record of loss. They were a testament to order, to a system carried out exactly as intended. The town forgot the children quickly, their faces blurred into memory, their names unspoken, their brief appearances in Brambleford streets fading like breath on glass. But in the locked drawer of the Kildare study they remained in perfect sequence, each slash a neat wound across the page, each hourglass frozen at the same moment, the last grains of sand almost gone but never fully empty. The doctor had lived long enough to know that the most unsettling deliveries often arrived without warning. On a late autumn morning in 1894, when the air smelled faintly of coal dust and frost, a wagon from the Kildare estate rolled into the yard behind his modest surgery. The driver did not knock at the front door but waited by the back entrance, his hands resting on the reins as though he wished to be gone before anyone asked too many questions. The object he had brought was covered in a heavy canvas, the shape beneath it angular and solid like the silhouette of a wardrobe. When the doctor came to inspect it, the man muttered that it was a donation for scientific study, a gift from Elias Kildare himself. He offered no other explanation, and the doctor, more curious than cautious, signed for the delivery without further thought. When the canvas was pulled away, the thing revealed was a cabinet of extraordinary craftsmanship, carved from dark oak so polished it reflected the lamplight like still water. The weight of it was such that it took two assistants to heave it inside, their faces reddening with the strain. Its doors were secured with a brass lock, and inside the keyhole the doctor saw a thin residue of some clear, sticky substance, as if the cabinet had been sealed for a long time. When the lock was opened and the doors swung wide, the smell came first, not the rank rot of fresh decay, but something more distant, medicinal, as though the air inside had been trapped in a foreign century. The shelves within were lined with glass jars of varying size, each one sealed tight with wax. Floating in the pale yellow liquid were shapes the doctor at first struggled to comprehend. The smallest were no larger than a walnut, smooth and pale like river stones. The largest were dense veined masses that seemed almost to pulse in the glass when caught in the lamplight. It took only a few moments before his training overcame his disbelief. These were organs, hearts, lungs, segments of liver and kidney, some unmistakably human, others so malformed or stunted that their origins could not be guessed. They were arranged with a collector's precision, ordered from smallest to largest, each jar bearing a neat handwritten label in Latin. Not the common Latin of anatomy texts, but the older, more obscure terms rarely used outside antiquated surgical manuals. The doctor lifted one jar carefully, turning it in his hands, studying the slanted script. The label read Cor Infans Tertius, which he translated after a moment's pause to Third Infant Heart. The number suggested there had been others. Another jar contained what appeared to be a pair of tiny lungs, the branching bronchi splayed like roots. Its label was Pulmone Septum, lungs 7. He could not tell if 7 meant an age, a count, or something else entirely. The arrangement struck him as deliberate, even ceremonial. The jars were not stored haphazardly, but in patterns, groups of 3, 6, and 9, numbers that repeated like a code only the Creator understood. Each shelf bore a thin strip of linen beneath the jars, as if to dignify their placement, and the interior wood was rubbed with some oil that gave it an unnatural gleam. He could almost imagine Elias Kildare standing before it at night, inspecting each specimen, adjusting a label, perhaps shifting a jar's position to restore some private symmetry. The doctor found himself wondering how many years it had taken to assemble such a collection, and from where the pieces had come. If they had been animal in origin, the labeling would have been less exacting. But the phrasing, the Latin, the sizes, these were not from creatures found in barn or forest. They were the pieces of people, most of them unmistakably young. A chill prickled at the back of his neck when he realized that many of the hearts were barely the size of plums. He thought then of the children who passed briefly through the Kildare household, their appearances fleeting as candlelight, and felt a weight in his chest that was more than dread. Elias's note, folded into a narrow envelope and placed inside the cabinet's upper drawer, was brief. It spoke of a contribution to the advancement of medical understanding, a belief that science should preserve what nature so often discards, and an insistence that the doctor's discretion would honor the dignity of the specimens. There was no signature, only the initial E. The handwriting was elegant, the loops of each letter confident and unhurried, as though the writer had been in no rush for the world to catch up to his vision. The doctor kept the cabinet in his surgery for several years, though he rarely opened it. When he did, it was usually at night after the day's patients had gone, when the lamps were turned low and the town beyond his walls was quiet. He would stand before the open doors, staring at the ordered rows, feeling the same unease each time. A sensation not of being in the presence of death, but of being in the presence of something that had claimed death as its own private language. The organs did not seem like remnants to him. They seemed like steps in some larger unfinished design. He told no one about the delivery. He signed no receipts that could be traced. In Brambleford, certain gifts were best left unspoken of, especially when they came from the Kildares. Over time, he came to think of the cabinet not as a medical curiosity, but as a boundary, a line he could not cross without losing something of himself. Yet he never destroyed it, never attempted to return it. It sat in the corner of his back room, patient and whole, as if waiting for the day when it would be needed again. The notebook was found in the hollow of a broken wall years after the Kildares were gone, its pages stiff with age. the handwriting uneven and childlike, and smudged in places where damp had bled the ink. It did not read like a diary so much as a confession no one had been meant to hear, a voice speaking from the shadows between memory and dream. The entries repeated certain phrases again and again. Quiet hours, no blinking the ledger, as if the child had been trying to capture something too strange for ordinary words. It was written without dates, as though the writer had lost all sense of time inside that house. The quiet hours began. The notebook claimed when the hallway clock struck 9 and the rest of the world seemed to fall away. The children, never more than 4 at a time, were led one by one into a room that smelled faintly of candle wax and leather. There were chairs arranged in a perfect line, high-backed and padded, their arms fitted with wide straps of buckled canvas. The straps were never pulled tight enough to hurt, but they were tight enough that the children could not lift their hands to their faces and could not wipe their eyes when they began to sting. Elias would move slowly among them, fastening the buckles with the careful precision of a man folding away fine clothes. Once they were secured, Margaret would enter with the ledger, a thick black volume whose pages had been worn smooth by years of turning. She would hand it to Elias as though she were handing over something alive, something that needed to be handled with respect. He would place it on the table before him, open to a page that had already been marked with a thin strip of red ribbon, and begin to read. His voice, the notebook said, was soft but steady, the words rolling out in a rhythm that never changed, a rhythm that seemed older than the walls themselves. The language was not English. It was not the Latin of church sermons either, though some words had that same ancient weight. The rule was that no one was allowed to blink until the candle on the table burned down to the notch cut in its side. The flame would sputter in the draftless air, throwing long shadows across the faces of the strapped children. At first, the challenge was only discomfort, the sharp itch behind the eyes, the heat of tears gathering without relief. But as the minutes stretched, the strain became something deeper, a pulling inside the mind. The words from the ledger seemed to seep into that space between breath and thought, so that the children could not tell if the shapes they saw in the shifting candlelight were real or rising out of their own exhaustion. When one of them did blink, Elias would stop mid-sentence. He would not shout. He would only close the ledger, walk to the child, and lean down so close that the notebook's author swore they could hear the slow drag of his breath. Then he would rest his palm against the child's cheek, not as a parent might, but in a way that seemed to measure the very stillness of their skin. The other children would sit frozen, staring straight ahead, because the rules did not change for them. The blinking child would be unstrapped without a word and led out of the room by Margaret. They never returned to the chairs. The notebook's writer described the sound of the candle's wax dripping onto the saucer, each drop a tiny reminder that the quiet hours had not yet ended. Sometimes the flame would burn low and stretch into a long, wavering point before collapsing into itself, and only then would Elias close the ledger and release them. Their eyes would be raw and red, but their silence was absolute, as if whatever had been read aloud in that low, steady voice had bound their tongues in ways they could not understand. What disturbed those who later studied the notebook was the absence of fear in some passages. The writer at times seemed almost soothed by the ritual, describing the way the straps felt like holding hands with the chair, or how the candle's glow made a place in the dark where the walls go away. It was as if Elias had trained them to find comfort in surrender, to feel safest when their movements were taken from them. The repetition of the ritual, always the same chairs, the same ledger, the same candle, had smoothed the edges of dread until the children no longer resisted. There was one entry that stood apart from the rest, written in a shaky, hurried hand. It told of a night when the candle burned past its notch and Elias kept reading. The hours stretched far beyond the usual measure, and the children's eyes watered until the tears ran freely down their cheeks and pooled at the base of their straps. The flame seemed impossibly tall, flickering as though something behind it breathed in time with Elias's words. The notebook said the shadows began to bend toward the children, long shapes folding over them like cloaks. And though they could not move, they felt a pressure in their chests as if something unseen were leaning closer. The entry ended abruptly, the last sentence trailing into an ink smear. There were no further pages. Those who found it believed this was the final night the writer ever sat in those chairs. No one knew what the ledger contained or why the blinking mattered, but the ledger itself was never found in the Kildare estate, as if it had left with Elias, or had never existed outside the rituals at all. The first whisper came from an old tinsmith who had once supplied the Kildares with blocks of beeswax. He claimed the orders were always large, far more than any household could need, even for candles. Elias had insisted on the finest grade, pale as bone and without a hint of scent, and he paid in precise sums of silver coins as though the transaction were part of a contract only he understood. At the time, no one thought much of it. Beeswax was respectable and useful, the sort of commodity that did not invite suspicion. Only decades later, when a trunk was pried open in the ruins of the estate's outbuilding, did the truth begin to drip into daylight, as slow and heavy as the substance itself. Inside the trunk were ledgers, not unlike those Elias had used in other matters, but these bore a different kind of record: temperatures, times, and cryptic notations beside each name. The pages smelled faintly sweet, but under that sweetness was another odor, faint but sour, the ghost of something once living. The pages detailed a process that was exact, almost mechanical. Heat the wax to a range that would not burn but would coat. Immerse slowly, beginning with the feet, pausing so the subject's breathing might settle. Continue until the crown of the head vanishes beneath the surface. Cool rapidly in the winter room until the form stiffens. Display, if desired, for a day or two before remelting for storage. The notion was almost too grotesque to believe, yet the body-shaped depressions found in the warped planks of the cooling racks told their own silent truth. Investigators imagined the scene with reluctant minds. The narrow copper tub set upon a brick platform, the fire banked low beneath it so the wax rippled like liquid amber. A child held still under the gentle but unyielding grip of Margaret's hands would be lowered in stages, their skin flushing with the unnatural warmth. The air around them thick with a cloying, honeyed perfume that turned the stomach. At first the wax would cling in thin, translucent veils, but with each immersion the layers would thicken, smoothing the face into a fixed expression that was neither peace nor agony but something between. What haunted those who examined the notes was the clear implication that Elias did not kill first. The immersion itself was the death. The entries described the moment when the wax reached the lips and a pause was taken, perhaps to watch the subject's final breath force a ripple through the molten surface before the last plunge buried their face forever. This was not frenzy, this was patience. It was the work of a mind that regarded human life as a raw material, to be shaped and unshapen at will. The statues that emerged must have been almost beautiful in their horror. The wax would have captured every lash, every strand of hair, and every tiny crease of skin, holding the body in a kind of eternal mid-motion. Hands could be arranged, eyes closed or left half-lidded, and the head tilted just so. They would not rot. They would not decay. They would stand in the frost-tiled chamber like figures in a museum awaiting some private audience that only Elias and Margaret attended. There was no proof of who saw them or for how long they were kept before the melting began, but the ledgers noted the cooling times with the same care given to the deaths themselves. Perhaps the most unsettling detail was the reuse. The wax was not discarded. Once the form had been admired or studied, whatever satisfaction Elias took from it, the figures were dismantled, returned to the copper tub, and melted down. The wax, now infused with the oils of skin and the faint residue of breath, would become the medium for the next drowning. It meant that each new child's end was layered upon the remains of all the others, that the substance itself carried a history of suffering in every particle. To burn a candle in the Kildare house, as guests surely once did without knowing, was to draw light from that history. Those who tried to understand the purpose of this ritual could only guess. Some suspected Elias sought to capture a perfect stillness, a moment before fear turned to struggle, preserving an image of obedience he could hold in his hands. Others believed the act was devotional, part of some unspoken rite in which the wax-bound bodies were offered not to God, but to a quieter, older presence that had no name in the town's churches. The careful heating, the slow immersion, the cooling in the frost room, all of it bore the weight of repetition, the shape of worship disguised as craft. When the trunk was shown to those who had once known the Kildares, few could bear to look for long. The neat handwriting, the orderly columns, the faint sweetness rising from the pages. These were not the relics of a madman's chaos, but the artifacts of someone who had long ago chosen to bind his evil in discipline. And discipline, they realized, was more terrifying than rage, for it meant there had been no accident, no loss of control, only intent carried out with the calm of daily work. The trunk was eventually locked away, though the smell of beeswax seemed to cling to it no matter how tightly it was sealed. Those who handled it spoke of a strange feeling in their hands afterward, as though a thin film remained on the skin long after washing, invisible but certain. And sometimes when the air was warm, they thought they could feel it softening. Margaret Kildare was known for her hands, small, pale, and quick, with fingers that never trembled even in the bitterest winter. In the market square, at the annual fairs, those hands would hover above a hoop of stretched linen like pale spiders weaving silk. Her embroidery was delicate beyond reason, the threads so fine they caught the light like strands of hair. Women whispered that she must have ordered them from Paris or Vienna, for no local merchant carried silk of that quality. But the truth lay far closer to home. in a locked drawer of the Kildare estate's upper sewing room, where glass jars sat in neat rows, each filled with powder the color of ash. Those powders were not purchased from any trader. They were made in the house itself, in a room that smelled faintly of scorched marrow. Elias, with his methodical patience, would burn the small bones, the kind left when the rest had been claimed for other uses, until they became brittle and pale, then crush them to dust beneath the pestle. Margaret would take the powder and mix it with mordants and dyes, producing colors no one could name. The whites had a luster like moonlight on wet stone, the grays shimmered with a faint metallic gleam, and the reds were unlike any found in nature, as if each stitch contained a trapped ember. The pieces she created were always pastoral: cottages under soft skies, sheep grazing on hills, rivers winding through meadows. They were scenes that drew praise for their tranquility, for the way they seemed to quiet the mind. But that quiet was a deception. Those who dared to look closer, who let their eyes linger too long, began to notice shapes that did not belong. In the shadow under a tree, a mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. In the ripples of a stream, the suggestion of hands reaching upward. In the pattern of the clouds, the faint contour of a face pressed against some invisible barrier. These details were too small to be seen at a glance, but once noticed, they could not be unseen. It was as though Margaret's needle carried two truths at once, the one shown to the world and the one whispered to herself. The surface said peace, but the silk beneath spoke of things trapped, things stilled, things unwillingly made part of the landscape. Some wondered if these hidden figures were accidents of pattern or tricks of thread and eye. But the repetition of their forms, always in positions of strain or despair, made that impossible to believe. They were placed with care, stitched into the scene as deliberately as the sheep or the cottages, as though the suffering itself was part of the natural order she wished to record. When questioned, Margaret would only smile, her lips curving with the same softness as her pastoral hills. She would say that her work was about memory, that every stitch preserved something the world was too quick to forget. Yet the memory she kept was not of seasons or harvests, but of stillness in another form, the same stillness her husband practiced in other rooms. Elias dealt in bodies, Margaret dealt in impressions. She had found a way to distill the essence of those who were taken, to capture not their likeness but the shape of their final fear, and hide it in plain sight where no one thought to look. Her fame in the fairs only grew. Judges awarded her ribbons for her light hand and serene imagination. Wealthy patrons commissioned pieces for their parlors, never suspecting that the delicate meadow hanging on their wall held the frozen echo of a child's final breath. The silk, dyed with bone ash, carried more than color. It carried weight, an unseen heaviness that made some visitors to those parlors uneasy without knowing why. There were accounts of guests glancing at the embroidery, frowning and turning away quickly as if something in it had stared back. It was said that Margaret worked most often at night under the faint glow of a single oil lamp, when the rest of the house was silent except for the ticking of Elias's study clock. She preferred long stretches of uninterrupted hours, the needle rising and falling in a rhythm that matched her own breathing. In those moments she was not simply decorating cloth. She was sealing away voices, Each pull of the thread was a tightening, each knot a closing of the mouth. She stitched until her fingers ached but never once drew blood, as if even her skin understood the need to keep the work pure. No piece ever stayed in the Kildare house for long. Once finished, they were given away or sold, scattered into the homes of others, as if Margaret wished to seed the world with her private record. The town came to believe she could not bear to part with them, that her generosity was reluctance disguised. But in truth, she needed them gone, needed the faces to live elsewhere, dispersed and unseen except by those who knew where to look. In this way, her victims were never truly lost. They hung in parlors, in dining rooms, and in nurseries, their features woven into the fabric of ordinary life, their existence denied, yet preserved. Years later, when the Kildare estate fell into ruin, a few of Margaret's pieces resurfaced in an auction lot. By then the silk had yellowed slightly, but the hidden faces had grown clearer with age, the dyes shifting so the pale threads caught light in unexpected ways. Some buyers claimed the expressions changed, depending on where one stood in the room. Others swore that if the embroidery was left in silence long enough, there came a faint rustle, like fabric stretching under a hand, or the breath of something that did not want to be forgotten. And somewhere, scattered in attics and parlors across the county, Margaret's landscapes still hang, their hills and skies hiding eyes that wait for the gaze that will finally see them. The townsfolk had always called it the winter room, imagining it as a cold retreat where one might keep root vegetables or extra bedding through the frost. The name had the comfort of the ordinary, a name that did not invite questions. But the truth was that the room's purpose had nothing to do with seasons and everything to do with endings. At its center was a floor made not of planks but of a complex hidden mechanism, the kind of work that required a mind obsessed with precision. Beneath its surface, gears waited in stillness, their teeth perfectly fitted, their motion so slow it could be mistaken for the shifting of the house itself. It was this floor that gave the room its secret name in Elias's private ledgers, the hourglass. The walls were bare, painted in a flat, pale hue that reflected whatever light came from above. In the ceiling, narrow funnels were set flush with the wood, invisible unless one knew where to look. From these openings came the sand, impossibly fine, white as sifted flour and dry even in the dampest winter. Elias had sourced it from far away, shipped in sacks marked for industrial abrasives, though its purpose here was softer, quieter. The first grains would fall with barely a whisper, drifting through the air like snow in a dream, settling on hair, on skin, and on the floor with the faintest tap. Then more would follow, always steady, always patient. The mechanism beneath the floor was the second part of the ritual. Once set in motion, the entire surface began to tilt by degrees so small they could not be felt at first. A marble placed on the boards would take nearly an hour to roll from one side to the other. But the shifting was deliberate. It directed the sand's fall toward the center where a body seated or curled would become the hollow into which every grain would slide. Over time, the tilt grew more pronounced until all the sand that had been drifting gently from the ceiling found its path downward, toward the single point where the child waited. No ropes were needed. Elias believed in stillness and the power of inevitability. Once the grains began to fall, the body's own instinct to avoid movement did the rest. The first minutes were almost peaceful, the sand cool and light like an idle blanket in winter. But as the minutes stretched, the weight began to grow. It pressed into the hollows of the collarbone, into the crook of the elbow, and into the spaces between fingers and toes. The grains sought every opening, filled every crease, and packed themselves into the shape they were burying. The true cruelty of the hourglass was its silence. Sand does not crash or splash, it hushes. Even a gasp or a sob becomes muffled when heard through a curtain of falling grains. The walls absorbed the rest. No sound left the room and no sound returned. The victim was entombed in quiet long before the last breath. That was the part Elias seemed to value most. Death here was not a spectacle. It was a slow, soundless erasure. Those who entered the hourglass room later, the rare investigators, the fewer still who survived their curiosity, spoke of the faint, lingering scent of something mineral and metallic, like old coins kept in a dry drawer. They described how the boards, though swept clean, always held a fine dust in the seams, a dust that clung to skin and refused to wash away completely. Some claimed that standing in the center, even in daylight, gave the sensation of leaning, as though the floor still remembered its movement and was waiting to begin again. In his ledgers, Elias recorded each use with the same notation: the name, the date, and a small perfect drawing of an hourglass. No cause of death, no marks on the body, just the symbol and occasionally a short note in the margin, words like complete or resolved. It was not merely a record, it was a kind of harvest book, each death a grain in his private collection of endings. The construction of the hourglass spoke of a mind that saw killing not as impulse but as craft. The balance of the tilt, the rate of the sand's fall, the way the ceiling funnels were arranged to ensure even coverage. All of it was the work of someone who measured lives the way a watchmaker measures time. There was no panic here, no heat of rage, only the cold arithmetic of inevitability. The most chilling detail came from a notebook found decades later, its pages warped from damp but still legible. It described the placement of a single candle on the floor beside the victim before the mechanism was set in motion. The candle's flame, steady at first, would flicker as the tilt grew, leaning slightly one way then another. By the time the sand reached the victim's chin, the flame would be almost hidden, visible only through the narrowing space between grains. The notebook suggested this was the moment Elias valued most, the sight of light and breath being smothered at the same pace, as if proving that both were made of the same fragile substance. When the hourglass room was finally abandoned, its ceiling funnels were boarded over and the floor was nailed in place. But the sand remained in the hollow beneath, sealed away like ash in a tomb. And those who lived near the ruins whispered that in the coldest months, when the house groaned under the wind, one could hear the faint, steady trickle of something shifting below, as if the grains had never stopped falling, as if the hourglass still kept time for someone unseen. And so the winter room's true name was never spoken aloud in the town, but it lingered in the minds of those who suspected, a shape they could not forget. It was not a season, not a shelter, but a device, one that measured out the last minutes of a life with the patience of eternity. In the Kildare household, photography was more than a hobby or a means of memory. It was a dark ceremony. Elias had mastered the art of the glass plate camera, a cumbersome device demanding patience and skill. Much like his own nature, the photographs taken were not mere portraits. They were, as he wrote in his private journal, the final residue of innocence, a sacred imprint captured exactly 1 hour before the child's death. The moment was carefully calculated, ritualized, and inseparable from the fate that awaited each child afterward. The hour preceding a killing was a time thick with silence and a slow, mounting tension. The chosen child would be brought to the parlor, a room bathed in muted light filtered through heavy curtains. Here Elias prepared his camera meticulously, adjusting the delicate glass plates coated with chemicals that would soon freeze the child's image in uncanny clarity. The child, always instructed to smile, would sit on a plain wooden chair, their posture held rigid by unseen pressure, their eyes forced to meet the lens. The smile was never natural. It was a forced shape, a mask Elias had perfected over the years. It flickered at the edges with the tremor of tears barely concealed, the eyes glistening with the residue of a fear too profound for words. The photograph was taken in absolute stillness. Elias's cold gaze never wavered, as if he sought to distill not only the child's likeness but the very essence of their final innocence, an essence slipping away as the shutter closed. The exposure lasted several seconds, long enough for every minute twitch, every breath caught in the throat to imprint itself onto the fragile glass. In these images, the children appeared almost alive, too alive, as though the photo held a secret pulse beneath its surface, a flicker of trapped soul caught between light and shadow. Margaret assisted quietly, her presence a soft counterpoint to Elias's rigidity. She smoothed the child's hair, fixed the collar, and whispered instructions that blended comfort with command. The photograph was as much a performance as a portrait, an enactment of final innocence staged before the impending horror. To outsiders, these photos seemed mere relics of Victorian sentimentality, tokens of charity and kindness. But to Elias, they were far more than that. They were instruments, vessels for something both scientific and supernatural. The photographs were then stored with exacting care, wrapped in velvet cloth and kept in a locked cabinet lined with lead. Lead was not chosen for its weight alone, but for its properties of silence and shielding. Elias believed that the glass plates, once exposed to the child's final moments, held an energy that could be captured, studied, and eventually manipulated. It was said that he conducted secret experiments combining mercury with the glass, using the reflective liquid metal to interact with the images in ways that defied contemporary science. The mercury was never explained, but those who glimpsed it described a substance both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling, capable of revealing shapes and shadows invisible to the naked eye. These experiments, though hidden, revealed the depth of Elias's obsession. He was not merely content with death. He sought to harness what lingered after life, the invisible thread between innocence and oblivion. The photographs were the key, an attempt to grasp the intangible residue of a soul slipping away, to turn it into something tangible, something that could be contained or even controlled. It was a chilling blend of ritual, science, and madness, where the boundaries between reality and the supernatural blurred into a shadowed ritual only Elias could comprehend. What made these photographs so haunting was not only their technical precision, but also the unspoken agony they contained. Each image was a silent scream, a moment frozen at the edge of terror and resignation. The children's eyes did not sparkle with hope. They shone with the wet gleam of tears hastily wiped away, a last effort to maintain the mask imposed by Elias. The smile was a cruel mimicry of happiness, a veil drawn tight over the unbearable truth that the child's world was about to end. The photographs were not trophies in a traditional sense. They were reminders, talismans bound to the ritual of death, pieces of a dark ceremony conducted behind closed doors. The town never understood the true meaning of these photographs. Over the decades, each new image introduced a different child, and yet, no one questioned why the faces changed while Elias and Margaret remained constant. The photographs hung in the Kildare home, displayed as evidence of charity and care, but were always removed just before the children vanished. To Elias, the photographs were final acts of preservation, capturing the last flicker of innocence before it was consumed. To Margaret, they were a part of her own silent complicity, the record of lives entwined with their shared, terrible secret. The photographs and glass and mercury intertwined symbolized the cold precision of Elias's mind. His evil was methodical, a calculated artistry that turned each killing into a ritual of control and containment. The face frozen in time was not just a face. It was the residue of life's final defiance, the soul's shadow clinging to a fragile surface. Elias sought to bind that shadow, to hold it fast, as if by capturing it he could deny the chaos and decay that inevitably followed. In the years after the Kildares' house was abandoned, the photographs remained hidden, their true nature unknown even to those who found them. Scholars who later examined them spoke of a strange light trapped beneath the glass, a shimmer that moved when the plates were tilted, as though the children's eyes followed the viewer with silent accusation. Some believed the mercury had formed a kind of mirror, a gateway between worlds, while others thought it was simply a cruel trick of alchemy. But all agreed on one thing: the photographs held a presence, a lingering imprint of something beyond death, forever suspended between innocence and oblivion. And so the ritual of the photograph was not an end, but a beginning, the final act before the slow, inevitable unraveling. Elias captured what he could not hold in life, the flicker of innocence before the extinguishing, and in doing so, wove his dark legacy into each fragile image. The glass plates, the mercury, the forced smiles, they were the silent witnesses to the horror that followed, the last testament of a mind that saw evil not as chaos, but as a precise, terrifying order. The town around the Kildare estate was a place built on whispered half-truths and fragile courtesies, where fear and power blended into a silence that spread like a slow poison. Rumors did not need to be spoken aloud to exist. They clung to the edges of conversation, slipping between the careful smiles of neighbors and the polite nods of shopkeepers. Over the years, as children disappeared without a trace, and as photographs showed new faces with forced smiles, the townspeople had a choice: to look closer or to look away. Most chose the latter, bound by a quiet terror that was as much about the Kildares as it was about themselves. Elias and Margaret were not just wealthy benefactors, they were the pillars of the community. Elias sat on every influential board, his ledger books holding the town's financial fate. Margaret's charitable work shielded the couple in layers of goodwill, making accusations seem not only absurd but also impossible. To challenge the Kildares was to risk social exile, or worse, a fate so vague and chilling that no one dared imagine it in detail. It was said that Elias's business partners vanished too, quietly removed or bankrupted, though no proof ever surfaced. The power they wielded was a net, tightening around anyone who might speak, ensuring silence with unseen threads. Fear is a powerful tool, but so is denial. The town wanted to believe in the Kildares' kindness, in the charity that fed orphans and clothed the poor. To admit the truth, that those same orphans were disappearing into darkness, was to shatter the fragile order that kept the town functioning. Many rationalized the disappearances as accidents or as the work of cruel fate. Others whispered of wanderers lost to the cold or sickness. But beneath these stories lay a deeper, unspoken understanding. Some evils were too vast, too dark, to face openly. It was easier to let the children vanish than to confront the horror lurking behind closed doors. When the Kildares themselves vanished, the town's silence reached its peak. One morning, the estate was found empty, the house locked from the inside, yet no one answered the persistent knocks. The townsfolk speculated endlessly, illness, flight, madness, but no one dared investigate thoroughly. The house was soon stripped of its furnishings, the valuable contents sold off piece by piece in hushed transactions that skirted legal scrutiny. Even the ledgers and photographs disappeared, locked away or burned, as if the very existence of the Kildares' secrets had to be erased. The house itself became a ghost, a presence felt in every shadowed street and whispered conversation. Children dared not approach the gate. Adults crossed the road to avoid its looming silhouette. Stories began to mutate, not just of cruelty but of curses and restless spirits. Some said that on cold nights a faint clicking could be heard from the empty rooms, the sound of a camera shutter, or the slow grinding of the hourglass floor below. Others swore the faintest flicker of light moved behind broken curtains, a restless echo of the Kildares' control. Yet the town remained silent. No council met to discuss the house, and no police inquiry was launched. It was as though the community collectively agreed that some things were better left forgotten. The economy depended too much on those who had vanished. The social ties were too tangled, and the fear of the unknown outweighed the courage to act. In that silence, the Kildares' legacy settled like dust, invisible yet impossible to fully erase. Decades passed, and the story faded into whispers told only in dimly lit rooms or behind closed doors. Older residents who remembered the children in the house carried the weight of unspoken guilt, their eyes clouded with the memory of innocence lost. Younger generations heard only fragments, tales distorted by time and fear. The Kildares became a cautionary shadow, a ghost story warning of what happens when a town chooses silence over justice. This silence was not born of ignorance but of complicity, a slow decay of moral courage that allowed evil to root itself deep. Elias's meticulous cruelty thrived because the town let it, because no one wanted to be the one to break the silence and face the unbearable truth. It was a lesson in how evil does not always shout. Often it whispers, hides behind normalcy, and uses silence as its most effective weapon. When historians finally uncovered the fragments of the Kildares story, they found not just records of horror, but a mirror reflecting the town's own choice to look away. The ruins of the estate stood as a testament, not only to the cruelty within, but also to the devastating cost of collective silence. The house was torn down, decades later replaced by a quiet park with a small plaque bearing no names, only the words, "Remember those lost in silence." And so the town lives with a shadow, a reminder that evil can flourish not only in the deeds of one, but in the silence of many. It was the spring of 1924 when the house on Haywater Lane, long abandoned and whispered about in fear, began to change once more. A new owner, unaware or uncaring of the past, set about renovating the crumbling estate, peeling back decades of dust and neglect. What they uncovered was not just the skeleton of a home, but a hidden vault of horrors meticulously preserved beneath layers of plaster and wood. Behind a concealed wall in the attic, workers breached a secret chamber. A dark, cramped space filled with objects so precise and chilling that the air seemed to still the moment it was opened. The first discovery was a collection of hundreds of glass photographic plates, stacked like fragile grave markers in lead-lined boxes. Each plate held the frozen smile of a child, faces caught in the final moments before oblivion. Their eyes, glistening with tears never fully shed, seemed to watch silently from the brittle surfaces. The sheer volume was staggering. Decades of children, one after another, each meticulously preserved not in memory but in glass and chemical stillness. These were not just images, they were relics of a ritual performed with obsessive care, a gallery of innocence stolen and sealed away. Beside the photographic plates stood an oak cabinet unlike any other in the house. It was heavy, ornate, and locked with multiple iron clasps, its surface scarred with faint scratches as if resisting the passage of time. Inside, the cabinet revealed something far more grotesque than any had imagined. Rows of wax molds lined the shelves, each a lifelike statue of a child, preserved in the haunting pose of death. The beeswax was smooth and pale, yet beneath the surface, subtle details betrayed the truth: the rigid tension in clenched hands, the faint traces of tears frozen midstream, and the hollow eyes staring into an eternal silence. These wax figures were the product of the wax drowning, the macabre method by which Elias had preserved his victims before their final disappearance. The wax, heated and poured with deliberate care, had sealed the children in a death pose, erasing the messiness of mortal decay and replacing it with a chilling stillness. Over time, the wax was melted down and reused, but these molds were the original imprints, the raw, undisturbed record of the final moments. They were evidence of a mind that demanded control over death itself, transforming suffering into cold art. Even more unsettling was the mechanical floor mechanism found beneath the cabinet, a smaller replica of the hourglass room's tilting boards. Its gears and pulleys were coated in a fine layer of rust, yet the craftsmanship was unmistakable. It was a model, a blueprint of cruelty reduced in scale, but no less precise. The floor slowly tipped, funneling fine sand into a cavity, just as the children had once been buried alive in silence. It was a dark testament to Elias's obsession, the obsessive repetition of ritual that allowed him to experiment with death's slow passage in miniature before unleashing it in full. The final, most mysterious discovery lay at the very bottom of the cabinet, a single undeveloped glass plate still sealed in its protective case, untouched by light or time. The image it held was a secret waiting to be revealed, a final residue of innocence yet unexposed. Whoever found it hesitated, sensing the weight of something both fragile and terrible. To develop the plate would be to confront the very last moment before an unknown child's fate was sealed. To stare into the silent abyss Elias had crafted with such exactitude. This unexposed photograph represented more than a single life. It symbolized the boundary between memory and oblivion, between the visible and the hidden. Elias's legacy was not only the lives taken but also the ritualized capture of their final breath and the meticulous cataloging of innocence as it slipped away. The glass plates, the wax molds, the mechanical models, all were fragments of a mind that sought to master death with a surgeon's precision and an artist's cold detachment. The sealed cabinet and its contents remained intact for decades after the discovery, locked away in archives that few dared to open. It was a haunting reminder that beneath the surface of a respectable town, beneath the veneer of charity and normalcy, lay a carefully concealed darkness. The cabinet was a time capsule of cruelty, a testament to the methodical, ritualistic evil that had thrived in silence and shadow. In the years following the unsealing, the town wrestled with the truth laid bare by the cabinet's revelations. The legacy of the Kildares was no longer a whispered rumor or a ghost story. It was a documented horror that demanded recognition. Laws were enacted to prevent such abuses, memorials erected in honor of those who had vanished, and confessions unsealed to shed light on a nightmare that had lingered just out of sight. The unsealed cabinet became a symbol, not just of evil's depths, but of the need to confront it before silence can make monsters immortal. The discovery also sparked philosophical reflection on the nature of evil itself. How could a mind so methodical, so calm, harbor such cruelty beneath a mask of normalcy? The Kildares embodied the terrifying truth that evil often wears the guise of order, that it thrives in the silence of a community that chooses not to see. The cabinet was a mirror reflecting back the darkest parts of human nature, where innocence is taken not with brute force but with cold, calculated patience. And so the cabinet remained a silent witness to a past that refused to be buried, a legacy etched in glass and wax, in sand and shadow. It asked questions that echoed long after the last photograph was developed, the last wax mold melted, and the last hourglass turned. What do we see when we look at the face of evil? And what do we choose to ignore? The unsealing of the cabinet was a rupture that shattered the long-held silence, ripping open a wound the town had tried desperately to forget. The glass plates, the wax molds, the hourglass mechanisms. They were no longer hidden relics but evidence that demanded reckoning. Public outrage ignited like a slow-burning fire, sweeping through the community and beyond. Newspapers ran grim headlines exposing the depth of the horror with stark clarity. What had been whispered fear and suspicion for decades became undeniable truth, raw and unbearable. The town's genteel facade cracked, revealing how deeply the Kildares' sinister rituals had been woven into the fabric of daily life, hidden behind charity and normalcy. In response, lawmakers moved swiftly. Child protection laws, once weak and unenforced, were rewritten and strengthened, designed to prevent any recurrence of such horrors. Institutions tasked with oversight gained power and resources with new mandates for transparency and regular inspections. But laws alone could not undo what had been done. They were a pale shield against the memory of so many lost lives. The scars on the town's conscience ran deeper than legislation could reach. Archives long sealed were thrown open to the public. Documents, ledgers, and personal accounts once locked away in dusty drawers became the foundation for historians, investigators, and families desperate to piece together vanished histories. Families who had buried pain in silence came forward, identifying children long thought lost to time. Their stories were fragments of grief, faces glimpsed in photographs, names scrawled in fading ink, lives that had been erased but were now clawing their way back into memory. These reunions, bittersweet and incomplete, offered some solace, but the shadow of so many unnamed children lingered like a ghostly presence. The Kildares' victims were never fully accounted for. Many remained nameless, faceless echoes of innocence stolen without witness. The legacy of Elias and Margaret Kildare was not just the evil they enacted, but the silence that allowed it to persist. Their house was gone, their bodies never found, but the imprint they left was indelible. The community learned a harsh lesson about the dangers of turning a blind eye, about how evil can hide behind the veneer of respectability, using kindness as a mask for cruelty. The Kildares embodied a nightmare made real, a mind so methodical, so consumed by ritual and control that it transformed children into trophies of a dark obsession, while the world around them pretended not to see. Today, memorials stand quietly in the town, humble stones marking the absence of those lost. Their names are read in somber ceremonies, a chorus of voices finally breaking you through the long silence. Scholars reflect on the Kildares' story as a grim testament to how evil can operate in shadows, sustained not only by acts of violence but by the fearful silence of communities unwilling to confront it. It is a legacy that challenges us to ask, how many horrors remain hidden behind normalcy, waiting in silence to be uncovered? How easily does evil wear the mask of innocence, slipping unseen through the cracks of society? The story of the Kildares ends not with justice fully served, but with a warning etched in time. It asks us to remember the cost of silence, to hold space for those whose voices were never heard, and to remain vigilant. Because evil, methodical and ritualistic, may never fully disappear. It only waits for the silence to return. What do you think? Could this happen again? The darkest truth about the Kildares lies not just in their acts, but in their extraordinary ability to cloak monstrous cruelty behind a mask of respectability. Elias and Margaret were not brutish villains dragging their horrors into the streets. They were, in the coldest sense, masters of disguise. Their evil was patient, precise, and calculated to blend into everyday life. They understood that true horror need not scream to be felt. It can whisper, hide in shadows, and flourish in silence. The smiles in their photographs, the charitable dinners they hosted, the orphans they appeared to save, these were the carefully woven threads of a grand illusion. It was a facade that demanded the town's trust, a slow erosion of vigilance that made the unimaginable possible. This kind of evil thrives because communities often choose silence over confrontation. Fear is not always loud. Sometimes it settles like a fog that numbs the will to act. people look away because to face such darkness means admitting vulnerability and complicity. The Kildare's story is a grim reminder that monstrous cruelty can live side by side with normalcy, that beneath polite smiles and social niceties there can be a calculated destruction of innocence. Evil in this form is methodical and ritualistic, not an outburst of madness but a controlled, deliberate erosion of life and trust. What makes this tale haunt us is how ordinary it all seemed until it wasn't. It forces us to question the nature of evil itself. How many facades hide the rot beneath? How many smiles conceal pain and how many silences hide screams? The Kildare's legacy warns that evil does not always announce itself. It often slips in unnoticed, sustained by a community's unwillingness to see, speak, or act. It thrives in the spaces left by silence, growing stronger as truth is buried beneath layers of denial and fear. As this story closes, the question remains chillingly open. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could a mind as methodical, as ritualistic, and as terrifying as Elias Kildare's find a place to hide in plain sight today? The answer is not comforting, for evil is not bound by time or place. It is a shadow that lingers wherever silence falls, waiting patiently for its next opportunity.